Okay, so we're diving into a book that's been generating a lot of buzz lately.
Yeah, capitalist realism. It's by Mark Fisher.
Have you ever felt like we're kind of stuck in this system, even when you see all the problems with it all around?
Well, that's exactly what Fisher's getting at.
Like, it's not working, but you can't really picture anything else.
Right. It's this feeling of being trapped. And he wasn't just some academic.
Right.
Fisher was a cultural critic, a teacher, and he had this really influential blog called K-Punk.
I've heard of that.
Yeah, where he explored these ideas and he connected with a lot of people.
So he was bringing these complex theories down to earth,
Exactly. He was making them relevant to our everyday lives.
which is what makes capitalist realism so compelling. It's not just about economics.
No.
It's about how this system shapes our whole way of being.
Exactly. How we think, how we feel, even how we dream.
So he's arguing that we can't even imagine an alternative to capitalism.
Pretty much. He calls it capitalist realism.
Okay, so it's like this reality where capitalism is the only game in town,
Exactly. Even when it's obviously not working for most people.
and he uses all sorts of different things to explore this.
He does. From pop culture and personal anecdotes to philosophers like Lacan and Zizek.
Okay, those are some big names.
Yeah, but he makes them accessible.
Hmm.
Lacan talked about how our reality is shaped by these structures we're not even aware of.
Okay.
And Fisher applies that to capitalism, like these invisible forces that are shaping our lives.
So capitalist realism is like this invisible force field that's keeping us from seeing other possibilities.
It's like it's become embedded in our culture, our institutions, everything.
Okay, so where does he start? How does he begin to unpack all of this?
Well, he opens the book with this really powerful image.
Okay.
He says, it's easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism.
Wow, yeah, I can see that.
Right.
You're scrolling through the news, you're seeing climate change, political turmoil, everything. And it's almost easier to just picture total apocalypse
Yeah.
than things actually changing for the better.
Right. And Fisher's arguing that that very feeling, that inability to see a different future, is a symptom of capitalist realism itself.
So it's like a self-fulfilling prophecy.
Exactly.
Because we can't imagine it, we don't even try to create something different.
And he argues that this is beneficial to the system. It keeps us passive and compliant.
Wow, it's a bit depressing.
It is, but he doesn't just stop there. He connects this to real-world issues,
Right.
like the mental health crisis. He argues that this rise in anxiety and depression and all these other mental health problems we're seeing,
Right.
it's not just some random coincidence. It's directly related to the pressures of living under late capitalism.
This constant hustle, always having to be on,
Exactly. This pressure to perform, to succeed, to be adaptable.
exhausting.
It takes a toll.
Yeah.
And that's where these thinkers like Lacan and Zizek come in.
Okay, so he's using their ideas to explain how capitalism is messing with our minds.
Literally shaping our desires, our perceptions, even our unconscious thoughts.
Okay, this is getting really interesting, but I have to ask,
Yeah.
is it really that hard to picture a world without capitalism?
It's become incredibly difficult, and not because there aren't viable alternatives. It's because capitalism has just become so entrenched.
So it's like we're seeing the world through these capitalist-colored glasses.
Exactly. And those glasses are distorting everything.
And he's saying we need to find a way to take them off.
We have to break free from this framework if we want to create something different.
Okay, so how do we do that? Where do we even begin?
Well, that's what we're going to explore as we dive deeper into the book.
Okay, I'm ready for the next level.
Let's do it.
Let's unpack some of these strategies for resisting capitalist realism.
All right, let's jump into Chapter 2. What if you held a protest and everyone came? So in Chapter 2, what if you held a protest and everyone came? Fisher's looking at protest movements.
So he's not saying that protests are useless, is he?
Not exactly, but he's definitely pointing out some limitations.
Okay.
Like, they've become almost ritualistic.
I can see that. Like you go to a protest to be seen, but you don't really expect it to change anything.
Right. And that's the kind of reflexive impotence he's talking about,
Yeah, like you go through the motions, but deep down, you don't believe it'll make a difference.
Exactly. And Fisher's saying that this is a huge obstacle to real change.
He uses the example of Leave 8.
Yeah, those big celebrity concerts to end poverty.
Right, right.
And he sees those as corporate anti-capitalism.
Interesting. So it looks like it's critiquing the system, but it's actually just reinforcing it.
Exactly. Like, it allows us to feel good about ourselves without actually doing the hard work.
So if protests aren't enough, what does he suggest we do?
He doesn't give us any easy answers, but he starts to point towards a different kind of politics.
What do you mean?
One that's not about appealing to those in power, but about building power from below.
Okay, so less about lobbying and more about grassroots organizing.
More about connecting with each other, building solidarity, creating spaces where we can imagine different ways of living.
So where do we find these spaces?
That's the challenge, right? And he doesn't have all the answers, but he's pointing us in a direction.
Okay, so chapter 3, capitalism and the real. Now, this is where he gets into some really complex ideas.
Yeah, this is where Lacan comes in.
Okay, tell me about Lacan. I've heard the name, but I'm not really familiar with his work.
So Lacan was a French psychoanalyst, and he talked about how our reality is shaped by these underlying structures that we're not even aware of.
Okay, that sounds pretty abstract.
It is, but Fisher makes it relevant to our understanding of capitalism.
Oh, so?
Well, Lacan makes this distinction between the real and reality.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Explain that to me.
So think of reality as the world we experience every day.
The routines, the news, the things we take for granted.
Exactly, but the real is this kind of underlying truth, this traumatic dimension that we try to avoid.
Can you give me an example?
Well, think about climate change.
Okay.
It's this massive threat, but we often find ways to ignore it, to push it to the back of our minds.
Right, because it's just too overwhelming to think about.
Exactly. And Fisher's arguing that capitalist realism works by keeping the real hidden, by distracting us with consumerism and entertainment.
So we're living in this kind of artificial bubble.
In a way, yes. And he says that to challenge capitalist realism, we have to confront these traumatic truths that it's trying to hide.
Okay, so we need to wake up to the real.
Exactly. But that's not easy to do. He talks about how even our attempts at resistance can end up reinforcing the system.
How so?
Well, he looks at student protests in the UK and France, and he's pretty critical of both.
What's his critique?
Well, he sees the French students as being nostalgic for a previous era, what he calls Fordism.
Fordism.
Yeah, that period of industrial capitalism with its stable jobs and strong unions.
Okay, so he's saying they're trying to go back in time.
Kind of. And he argues that that's not a viable solution.
What about the British students?
He argues that they're too easily co-opted by the system. He uses the term liberal communism to describe this.
Liberal communism? What's that?
It's this tendency to try to reform capitalism from within, to make it more ethical or sustainable.
Okay, so it's like putting a Band-Aid on a gaping wound.
Exactly. And Fisher argues that this is the dominant ideology of our time.
Because it allows us to feel like we're doing something without actually challenging the system.
Exactly. It's a way of maintaining the status quo.
So even our critiques can end up being absorbed by the system.
That's the danger. And he's calling for something more radical, a new kind of political subject that can truly break with capitalist realism.
So we need a new way of thinking, a new way of organizing.
Exactly. We need to move beyond these old frameworks.
But how do we do that? Where do we even start?
Well, that's what he starts to explore in the next chapter, which focuses on this pivotal moment in history, October 6, 1979.
October 6, 1979. Why is that date so significant?
That was the day the Federal Reserve in the U.S. drastically increased interest rates.
Okay.
It was the beginning of the neoliberal era.
So the era of deregulation, privatization, all of that.
Exactly. And Fisher argues that this shift had a huge impact on our lives, not just economically, but culturally and psychologically.
He uses the film Heat to illustrate this, right?
Yes. He contrasts it with older gangster films like The Godfather
Okay, I'm following you.
to show how the social landscape has changed under neoliberalism.
How so?
Well, the criminals in Heat are these rootless mobile crews operating in a world of anonymous freeways and corporate spaces.
Sounds familiar.
It's a world where nothing is permanent, where flexibility is prized above all else.
And he's linking that to the rise of precarious work, the gig economy.
Exactly. And he argues that this has led to a decline in mental health.
So he's saying that the way capitalism is structured is making us sick.
He cites research from psychologists who've documented this rise in mental distress, and they link it to the values promoted by what they call selfish capitalism.
It's not just about economic inequality or environmental destruction. It's about how the system is affecting our mental well-being.
Exactly. It's a deeper level of damage.
Okay, this is pretty bleak. But Fisher doesn't just leave us there, does he?
No. He starts to offer some potential solutions, ways to resist this onslaught of precarity and alienation.
I'm all ears.
And in the next chapter, he focuses on one of the most frustrating features of late capitalism.
Bureaucracy.
Bureaucracy. But didn't neoliberalism promise to get rid of all that red tape?
That was a promise.
Okay, so we're back and ready to wrap up our deep dive into Mark Fisher's capitalist realism.
We've covered a lot of ground, haven't we?
Yeah, it's been intense, but also really thought-provoking.
It has.
Fisher's laid out all these challenges we face under capitalist realism,
That feeling that there's no alternative, the sense of powerlessness.
and all the ways the system keeps us distracted and divided.
Yeah.
But the big question is, does he offer any solutions? Or are we just doomed?
Well, he definitely doesn't think we're doomed.
Okay, good.
Fisher firmly believes another world is possible.
That's good to hear.
But it requires a pretty radical shift in how we think and act. So where do we even start? What does that look like?
The first step is recognizing that capitalist realism isn't some natural law. It's a system created and maintained by people.
So we have the power to change it.
Exactly. It's about reclaiming our agency, remembering that we're not just passive recipients of this reality.
We can shape it.
We can, and he argues that even small acts of resistance can have a ripple effect, especially when they're connected to a larger vision.
Okay, so what kind of vision are we talking about? He mentions creating a new political subject, right?
Yeah, one that's not bound by old ideologies or ways of organizing.
So what would that look like?
He's calling for a new kind of movement. It's not just about protesting what we don't want.
It's about building something new.
Exactly. And he suggests this new left could tap into those desires that neoliberalism has created but failed to satisfy.
Like what?
Like the desire for real autonomy, meaningful work, a sense of community, connection to something larger than ourselves.
Okay, yeah, those are things a lot of people are longing for.
Exactly. And he talks about moving beyond the traditional focus on taking over the state.
So not just about winning elections.
Right. It's about building power from below.
Okay, so what would that look like in practice?
It could involve creating alternative structures, meeting people's needs outside the market system.
Like co-ops, community gardens, things like that?
Exactly. Creating spaces where people can experience a different way of living.
A way of life that's not all about consuming and competing?
Exactly. He calls it a dual power strategy.
Dual power.
Challenging existing power structures while building alternatives that can eventually replace them.
Kind of like building a new society within the shell of the old one.
You got it.
He also talks a lot about the need to challenge consumerism.
Yeah, and not just in terms of buying less stuff.
It's a deeper shift in values, right?
Exactly. It's about rejecting that whole mindset that more stuff equals more happiness.
Finding fulfillment in things other than material possessions.
Exactly. He suggests this could actually lead to greater well-being, you know?
Less pressure to consume, less anxiety about keeping up with the Joneses.
Right. And he talks about something pretty radical, too.
Makes sense.
Converting mental health problems into effective antagonisms.
Whoa, okay, break that down for me.
He's arguing that mental health issues are often a sign that something is wrong with the way we're living, that the system itself is making us sick.
So instead of just medicating people, we need to address those root causes.
Exactly. And he believes that channeling that disaffection, that alienation and despair into collective action could be a powerful force for change.
Okay, so it's about taking that pain and turning it into something positive, something that can actually transform society.
Exactly.
So we've got a lot of work to do here.
We do.
But where do we go from here? What are the key takeaways from capitalist realism?
Well, I think the most important takeaway is that we need to start questioning everything. We need to challenge that assumption that there is no alternative, that this is just the way things have to be.
So it's about waking up from that dream of capitalist realism.
And realizing we do have the power to create a new reality.
And it starts with those small acts of resistance.
Challenging the dominant narrative, connecting with like-minded people, building those alternatives.
So what's your capitalist realism?
That's a good question.
What's that thing you've just accepted as normal, even though you know it could be different?
Maybe it's the way we work, the way we relate to each other, or the way we think about the future. It could be anything, really.
Fisher's message is, don't let capitalist realism steal your dreams.
Exactly.
Capitalist realism is a challenging book, but it's also incredibly inspiring.
It is.
It reminds us that we do have the power to change the world, even if it doesn't feel like it right now.
And it all starts with imagining that different world.
Exactly. So what kind of world do we want to create? What would a future beyond capitalist realism look like?
That's the question we all need to be asking ourselves.
And that's a wrap on our deep dive into capitalist realism.
Thanks for joining us.
We hope this has given you some food for thought and maybe even inspired you to take action.
Keep questioning, keep exploring, keep resisting.
And until next time, keep learning.